especially artificial brains, is one of my research specialties, so I can speak with some authority on this point. I've written a book about the rise of intelligent machines, The Intellect War. Cosmos versus Terrans, a bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines. Hence, the only effective alternative to translation programs, if one wants quality worldwide communication and transmission of knowledge, is to learn the world language and then to create internet documents in that language. I cannot read Chinese yet. Well, I won't bother ad-libbing. I have such a low opinion of Chinese culture. The culture is intellectually sterile. It's a brutal dictatorship. So there's no reward, there's no payoff if I bother to learn the incredibly clumsy, stupid Chinese writing system. And since China doesn't have a single really world-class intellectual pushing new ideas that is new to the planet, there's no reward. So I don't bother. So I cannot read Chinese yet. No, there's no yet. In a year or so I'll leave this shithole, go back to the West. So no point learning it. So I use an internet translation program that takes Chinese text and translates it into English text. It's good enough for me to get the general idea of what the document is about, but the general quality of the translation is so bad, it's a sick joke. It's appalling. I'm talking about Google Translate. This situation will remain true for many years for any translation program, so for good planetary communication, a knowledge of English will be essential. Once more educated people have mastered English across the planet, the exchange of ideas, opinions, ideologies, knowledge, business deals, etc. will skyrocket. The world will be transformed. Once many countries feel they understand each other through use of a common language, then the general level of trust between those countries, particularly between the leaders of those countries, will increase. Hence collaboration between them will increase. This is what is happening already in Europe. European leaders now will often close themselves in a room with no interpreters to thrash out agreements in an intimate face-to-face manner, all speaking English. Imagine the effect on world politics if all political leaders could do that. We're getting there. There are many international meetings now between world leaders. Those whose English is poor feel left out, somehow less cosmopolitan, less worthy, thus motivating them to improve their English so that they can chat amiably with the other leaders. Tourists will be better able to communicate with the locals if the locals speak the world language. This will increase the trust level between nations at the level of the common people. If relations between two countries are good due to heavy tourism between them, with both peoples having good contact due to being able to speak the world language, then it will be more difficult for the leaders of one of those countries to strongly criticize the leaders of the other country. Their respective peoples will not agree with their leaders and may vote them out at the next elections. Imagine that the leaders of a given country A do something that rouses great hostility with most other countries. With a global media and knowledge of the world language, the citizens of country A will be able to observe for themselves the general hostility of the majority of other nations. The citizens of country A will be able to understand what the peoples of other nations are saying. When they learn, for example, that more than 90% of other countries are hostile to their own leaders, then that will have a powerful effect on them. They'll be very much inclined to think that their own leaders have done something wrong, and hence they will put pressure on their leaders to change policy, or at least in countries that are not dictatorships. In a dictatorship, there will probably not be a world media, because the dictatorial leaders will not permit it, as in shithole China, for example. What about longer term? What happens when English is so dominant that most knowledge and material is expressed in it? What will happen to the other languages? Many of them will die out, more or less. For example, let me give a concrete case from my own observation. In the 1970s, I moved from Cambridge, England to Eindhoven, Holland, as a stepping stone towards my beloved Brussels, which was for me the most cosmopolitan place on earth, capital of the EU, where you can hear a dozen or more languages in the tram every day. I noticed that a Dutch translation of an English language paperback book was often about 3 times more expensive than the English original. The economies of scale possible with a large English reading market allowed the English version of the book to be much cheaper. Dutch readers would often prefer to buy the English book rather than the Dutch version because of the price and because of their good ability to read English. Their English was good because as children they had grown up with spoken English TV programs with Dutch subtitles. The net effect was that many books were simply not translated into Dutch because the Dutch buying public had become too small. Everyone was buying the English version of the book. The bookstores had lots of Dutch books, but also many English books too. My Dutch colleagues were telling me that the Dutch book market was dying because of English. Let us extrapolate this argument to the future. Imagine a Japanese child having to learn the Japanese character-based writing system that is very similar to the Chinese characters, but with 2 phonetic alphabets thrown in. Imagine the child knows from experience that 95% of the material he can get on the internet is in English, and that most of it is of higher quality and more interesting than what is in Japanese. He may be very disinclined to spend a lot of effort in learning his own country's writing system because it's so unintelligently conceived, and he may be well aware that in the Japanese school system it takes 9 years to learn. In time, there may be a rebellion by the Japanese students who simply refuse to learn what they may come to see as an unintelligent, outmoded, redundant writing system. A similar logic might also apply to Chinese students, but probably less so due to the fact that China has 10 times the population of Japan and hence generates hugely more web pages in Chinese than Japan does in Japanese. It's possible then that in the longer term English may come to replace local first languages, perhaps not in speech but in education, and reading and writing. If English becomes people's thinking language, then they may feel more comfortable talking in English if they want to express themselves on topics that they have studied only in English, which may be most topics. We could see hundreds of languages die in this sense, or at least see the creation of hundreds of patois, that is, hybrid languages, part local, part English. M. The Glow Media Project. Glow Media stands for Global Media. I believe that one of the most important tasks that the Globus should undertake is to create a global media, and by that I mean setting up an institution by which the world's citizens are given the world's media, so that all the television, radio, newspapers, books, magazines, etc. are provided to everyone on Earth connected to the internet. Since the size of the public will be huge, the price of access to certain information would be very small, and global competition would keep prices low. Despite low prices for the individual consumer, the billions of people involved would still make publishing profitable, so there should be no objection to putting very cheap material on the internet. Of course, governments and other institutions will provide material for free, tons of it. They will be trying to influence a global public of the value and prestige of their institutions by allowing millions or billions of people to judge for themselves the quality of the material these institutions provide. For example, take the university lectures of professors at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in Boston, Massachusetts, USA, one of the top engineering universities in the world. If millions of people are convinced that MIT professors give very good lectures on the internet, then the prestige of MIT goes up. If the Sorbonne tries to do the same thing, but the lectures are all in French, then only French-speaking people will watch the lectures on the internet. If some of the French professors start giving their lectures in English to a world audience, then they will have a world audience, thus motivating them to make the switch. This logic will hold all over the world. Why lecture to millions when you can lecture to billions with a B? How could a Glow Media project get off the ground? Who would organize it and who would pay for it? Several possibilities exist. Here are some practical suggestions. One option is to do nothing and let things evolve spontaneously. For example, already on the internet are many TV and radio channels that one can watch or listen to. Companies exist on the internet that provide connections to these radio and TV channels. This spontaneous growth could eventually connect all media to the internet, but it would be disorganized, disintegrated, chaotic, but at least it would be there. A more organized, more coherent scheme would be to create an institution which systematically collects all the media it can and connects it into an organized framework. As this institution grows in prestige, those media outlets not belonging to it would feel less prestigious and hence be motivated to join it. A snowball effect would result until it reaches saturation. Virtually all media on the planet would belong to it. Once this process is well underway, users could consult it in ways such as the following. Imagine you want to watch a TV program about a particular country or region. You talk to your computer, which then finds a list of relevant programs. It gives you the option of watching a quick sample of the program. Perhaps the program is dubbed into several languages. so you choose the language you want. Since dubbing is expensive, only a few languages will be used, including most probably English. This logic applies to all countries, so when the time comes for people to choose which languages to dub into, as the proportion of listeners who can listen to English rises, the number of dubbed languages per program will decrease to make the program production cheaper. What might a catalogue of the world's media look like? It might be broken down into continents. For example, Asia, Europe, South America, etc. One chooses a continent, then a country, then a region, etc., until one finds the medium one wants. Or more directly, one talks to the system and asks for a type of program, and the system does the searching for you. More specifically, imagine the impact on people if they could watch documentaries on whatever topic they wanted. Ad-libbing. I was writing this in 2007. Well, it's now 2017. We are pretty well there. I mean, look at YouTube. I mean, YouTube's grown enormously in that decade, although they're now starting to censor the stupid idiots. So that will kill them eventually, because people will migrate to uncensored platforms. Okay, back to the book. For example, I learned that ending roughly 1,300 years ago, about 1 million Koreans fled to Japan to escape some horror that was occurring in Korea at that time. What horror? What was going on in northeast China that forced the Koreans to flee, and in such large numbers that they fundamentally changed Japan, making the Japanese essentially Koreans, genetically speaking? I still don't know. Imagine I could pose this question to the Glow media system in my living room and be given a selection of documentaries from around the world, most of them with at least an English dubbing, or better, in good original English. If I could have such a system, it would hugely change my mentality. I could use the resources of the world to educate myself. I would become much more global in my outlook, because I would be given views and information from many resources, some of them conflicting. Ad-libbing, Google allows you to do that pretty much now. You can just type in any question you like in the search window of Google, and the level of artificial intelligence used by Google is pretty hefty. They have hundreds of employees who are artificial intelligence, AI, PhDs. So Google's ability to answer general questions that you just type in is pretty good, impressive. So things have improved that way a lot over the past decade. Some years ago, a group of European historians from different countries got together to attempt to write a history textbook for high school students that dealt with the events of World War II, and particularly the events that led up to the conflict. These historians were largely monos, brought up within their respective countries, and the unconscious views of those countries. Interestingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they could not agree. They eventually abandoned the project. More recently, historians from Korea, Japan and China got together to attempt a similar project relating to the Japanese invasion of Korea and China. This time, however, they were successful. By studying hard each other's viewpoints, they managed to come to a consensus, and the book was eventually published in 4 language versions: Korean, Chinese, Japanese and English. For the Japanese particularly, the book was eye-opening. Most Japanese had never been exposed to what their parents or grandparents had done in the war without Japanese censorship. Each country brainwashes its citizens consciously or unconsciously regarding its role in history. A monocultured media is inherently distorted, biased and incomplete. One of the fundamental aims of the Glow Media project is to overcome this bias by providing a global perspective to events and values. The Glow Media project is a fundamental stepping stone to converting billions of monos into multis. What are some other ideas on how a Glow Media project might be created? One idea is to suggest that politically minded globists band together to form a company or an organization that finances Glow Media's creation. This would be a political act, an ideological act, aimed at helping globalize the planet and motivating monos to start thinking globally. It would be a massive planet-wide educational exercise. It should be one of the most important goals of the globists. N. Global cultural homogenization. One of the basic assumptions of this book is that it will be impossible to create a global state unless there is a global cultural homogenization, that is, exposing the world's citizens to the world's media, to the world's opinions and ideas, so that the sources of information, that is, from the whole planet, that are given to people are the same. This in turn will lead to the creation of English as the world language. Once that happens, the transmission and sharing of ideas will be much easier. All the forces discussed in the sections above will play a role in culturally homogenizing the globe. This process need not happen simultaneously across the planet. Very properly, it will happen first in the rich democratic countries. The EU is well on the way in this respect. Other countries and blocs will follow suit and then join into larger blocs. The US and Canada are much the same culturally and speak the same language, so it's not surprising. Many people joke about Canada being the US's 51st state. Economically, it's true. The US and Canada could merge fairly easily. The Mercosur countries in South America are Spanish/Portuguese-speaking countries with a similar culture, so they could merge fairly easily. But how would the South Americans and the North Americans merge? I just don't see this happening easily until all those countries spoke the world language fluently. Otherwise, the cultural differences and the level of distrust between them would be too great. How would Arabs with their Islamic religion merge with atheistic Europeans? They wouldn't. The cultural differences at the time of writing are too great. It's unrealistic to expect such mergings at the present time. Hence, a lot of cultural transformation is necessary before such mergings can take place. Another basic assumption of this book is that people are programmed in their opinions, largely by what media they absorb. Hence, by having a global media in a global language, most people will come to think in the same way, that is, globally. Their horizons will be global, not national. When everyone thinks in more or less the same terms, having similar values, then it becomes much easier to get people to agree. Those countries most similar culturally can merge first into larger units. In time, the larger units can merge into even larger units until the whole planet has been absorbed into it, into globa. O. Multi-ideology. In quotes, monos are boring. If the multis are to form into political groups that eventually become globist, they will need an ideology, a political agenda. One of the major aims of this book is to help provide such an ideology, explaining why the creation of Globa, the global state, would be a good thing for humanity. A summary of the main arguments of this book is found in the last chapter, chapter 12, but we still need to discuss further points of that ideology. That we do here. This section makes some suggestions that the globists can use to strengthen their case and to make their efforts more successful in the global political arena. Probably the greatest source of opposition against the globists will come from the mono-nationalists. Many monos will not be interested in becoming multis and will block the efforts of the globist multis. They may block the globists very powerfully, either through inertia or very actively. The globists will need an ideological weapon to counter the monos. What might that weapon be? I suggest the globists use a form of ridicule, analogous to the distinction between a country bumpkin and a city slicker. That is, between a person from the countryside whose mind is made simple by the limitations of life on the farm, compared to the sophisticated city dweller whose mind has been made sophisticated by the complexities of city life. The analogy is fairly easy to see. A mono, by definition, is a person who's limited as an individual by the limitations of the single, or mono, culture that programs that person. On the other hand, a multi is programmed by several cultures and has a sense of cultural relativity. A multi can see a situation or belief from several cultural viewpoints due to the fact of having lived in or having been heavily exposed to the media of several cultures for many years. A multi is much more sophisticated about the world than a mono. A mono will see only his monoculture and interpret the world through the spectacles provided by his monoculture. A multi will have a set of spectacles and even a meta-spectacle that can be used to look at the spectacles. That is a kind of meta-level reasoning that can be applied to the situation when customs or views conflict. For example, what is a multi to do when confronted with the fact that it is socially taboo in Japan to blow one's nose in public, but sniffing is acceptable, whereas in Western countries the reverse is true? Multis can use the term mono as a form of rebuke or criticism against monos for not being multis. This may not seem particularly potent at the present time, but consider the following historical analogy. Two 2 centuries ago, there weren't many city slickers in the Western countries. Most people lived on farms in small communities. So if a city slicker were to label a farmer as a country bumpkin, probably the farmer would not feel offended, because nearly everyone at that time was a farmer, hence a country bumpkin. But today, being labelled a country bumpkin is a real insult, because most farmers know that city dwellers are much more sophisticated. For example, consider the many jokes by Manhattan-dwelling New Yorkers directed at New Jersey suburbanites. New Jersey neighbours Manhattan for non-Americans. I remember a joke by the American pop singer Madonna in a movie she was in, where a friend of hers in the movie said to her, "I haven't seen you for ages. I thought you were dead." To which Madonna replied, "Nah, I was in New Jersey." At the present time, the proportion of the population in the rich countries who are multis is still small, probably less than 10%, and most of them would be world-travelling businessmen. Europeans have an easier time becoming multis due to their multicultural television and the small size of their countries. Countries like China and Japan are more mono because of political and geographical reasons. China is as large as the US, so it's more difficult to leave the country to be exposed to the norms of other cultures. This logic applies to the US as well. Americans are much more mono than Europeans for that reason. China is also mono because its government bans its population from receiving television channels from other countries. Japan is extremely mono because it is so culturally homogeneous and an isolated island. Its government also bans overseas channels, especially Chinese TV channels. The terms mono and multi are powerful because they focus attention on the new concepts that they label. If a person hears a new word, the instinctive question arises, what does ... mean? A new word often creates a new concept in the mind of the listener or reader. Any self-respecting ideological writer knows this, and often will invent new terms to label the new ideas he has created. I certainly do this. Look at the size of the glossary. There are some 100+ original terms there. For example, in the mid-1970s, I coined the term masculist to label a man who liberates himself from the traditional male role of working for a financially parasitic woman, and a slew of other masculist terms as well. One of my next books will probably be on masculism. If I Google this term at the time of writing, there are 65,000 hits. That was in 2007. Since this word is so obviously the male equivalent of the word feminist, it has probably been reinvented several times and with differing definitions. So I learned early on that there is power in labels. Where would Marx have been without terms like proletariat, surplus value, dialectical materialism, alienation, etc.? In the 1980s, I coined the term artellect, that is, artificial intellect, to mean a godlike, massively intelligent machine. It was in the title of my first book, The Artellect War, Cosmos versus Terrans. A bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines. That was published. Googling the term artellect at the time of writing resulted in about 20,000 hits. That was in 2007. If you Google the term artellect today, I haven't done it for a while, so I can't tell you, but you can do it. Artellect, A-R-T-I-L-E-C-T. Yeah, Google it, see how many hits. The term artellect now has moved into the dictionary. It's just part of the English language now. And many other, what's the generic term? Institutions, whatever, have taken up the word for their own purposes. Like there's a fab, like a electronics fabrication plant in France, I think, called Artellect, Inc., Artellect. There's a pop group called Artellect. There's computer games called Artellect. And so on. So hopefully the terms mono and multi will be taken up by the world community and used to foster the growth of globism. Hopefully in the future a multi, when confronted with the limited views of a mono, can label a mono to his face. You have a mono mind. Once the label is sufficiently well known, the mono will probably take it as an insult, as it was intended to be by the multi. This implicitly assumes that even the mono accepts the idea to be labelled a mono is an insult, As multis become more common, as globalist ideology spreads, monos will begin to come under a growing social pressure to become more multi, to broaden their minds, to travel more, to watch more multicultured material on the internet, etc. P. Global mentality. In 50 years from the time of writing, I would not be at all surprised to learn, if only I'd still be alive to see it. 50 years? Probably not, unless there are major technological revolutions in geriatric research. That young people living in that era will take having a global mentality for granted. It would be universal and unquestioned. What would such a mentality be like? We already have a taste of it at the time of writing. For example, business travellers fly from airport to airport, and due to the fact that there are really only two major passenger airplane manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, that is the US and Europe, most airports look the same all over the world, except perhaps in the very poorest of countries. International businessmen usually speak English well enough to be able to make business deals. International scientists attend world conferences and speak to each other in fairly good English, because they spend much of their time reading scientific papers, nearly all written in English. Many scientists now from non-speaking English countries write textbooks directly in English, much to the scorn of native English speakers, but it is happening more and more. So a small but growing portion of the world's population is transforming itself from being monos to multis, with a multi-mentality. But even today's multis will not be a match for tomorrow's globers or globans, that is, people with truly global mentalities. Just what might this mentality be like? Imagine what it might be like to have global media with most of it in English. One's thinking would be profoundly influenced. One would be familiar with most countries and their characteristics, or at least the most intelligent portion of the population would. But they are the people who matter, because they are the leaders, the opinion makers. The less intelligent portion of the population are the opinion absorbers. So if they are fed a global media diet, they will learn to think globally, or more cynically, be programmed more globally. Everyone would have a sense of cultural relativity. People would be accustomed to hearing in English, "Oh, you X's, you're all the same, you think that ... And to the non-X's it would be true, so the X's would learn how their stereotypical behaviour is seen by non-Xists. Being exposed nightly in one's living room with programs and information from the world in 3D real-life images in the world language would mould the mind powerfully into a global mentality. Children especially would think globally. Children have to learn a set of behaviours that is new to them anyway. That's the nature of childhood. They start off with tabula rasa, blank slate minds. You can take a child from any country at a young age and transport him/her to another country, and that child will grow up with the norms and behaviours of that second country. We are all products of our cultures, but monos don't know that. Hence, many of the behavioural patterns of a mono are unconscious and not questioned. We behave this way because it's the custom. Custom is energy saving, less costly on the brain in terms of stress. People are more relaxed when functioning in a routine environment than when confronted with overwhelming novelty. Children and adults will be able to form friendships and relationships across the planet. Computers will be able to select potential friends from amongst billions, not millions of people, because everyone will be able to speak the world language. Hence the size of the potential friendship pool and mate pool will expand into the billions. As such friendships and relationships increase in number and intensity across the planet, the world will become more closely bound, more globally, culturally homogeneous. Once the planet is culturally and linguistically homogeneous, the major stepping stones are in place to form a global state. And that is the end of chapter 5. Next chapter, chapter 6, is entitled Institutions of Globa. So I'll stop here. Ciao.